Welcome back, rock stars, to yet another episode of From the Vault. Rikki Roxx here with the retro action figure review. We got an exciting day because we are back with even more DC action. Specifically, we're going way back to the mid-90s. We're going to be taking a look at 4 different figures from Superman, the animated series. Check it out. Alright, as I said, we're back, and today we're going to be taking a look at a few action figures from the Superman animated series line by Kenner back in 1996 through, I believe, 98 or 99. I'd have to check on that. But the fact of the matter is, this was the first series of action figures based on the Superman cartoon show that was pretty popular back then. Not quite so popular as the Batman animated series it's so fondly remembered, which is kind of a shame because I feel like the Superman show is every bit as good and every bit as great of a depiction of Superman as the Batman cartoon was for Batman. It's just, I guess because of various scheduling issues, time slot things, a lot of people didn't really catch the show during its first run. The toy line seemed to do pretty well. It went on for a few years, had several waves. Now, the mid-90s were a really exciting time for DC Comics action figures because we were seeing a lot of different waves come out. For the first half of the decade, it was mostly just Batman everywhere you looked. Movie Batman, animated Batman, Legends of Batman, The Dark Knight Collection, Legends of the Dark Knight. There was Batman everywhere for the first half of the 90s, but if you were a fan of other DC characters, say for example Superman, then you were left wanting for a very long time. But then, in the mid-90s, some exciting things started to happen, and Kenner delivered a 1-2 punch with their Superman lines. Almost concurrently, they launched the comic book-based Superman the Man of Steel collection, which complemented the Legends of the Dark Knight Batman line. The scale was very similar, the posability, so they went in really well together. That line was based on the comics, but just about the same time, Kenner launched this line of Superman action figures, specifically for people who were in love with the animated series. So this was great, because after years as a Superman fan of not having any Superman figures to mess with, finally you did. And you had comic book and cartoon-based figures to play with. It's raining outside. Hope you don't pick too much of that up, but it'll pass shortly. It's Jersey, right? If you don't like the weather, just wait 5 minutes, it'll change. Getting back to the topic at hand. So, it might surprise you, but even though I was super excited for both the comic book Man of Steel collection and the animated series line, I only picked up a couple figures back then, because as I mentioned on the channel before, I wasn't heavily into collecting anything but wrestling figures in the late 90s, so I took a break from almost everything else, and I cherry-picked a little here, a little there, but didn't grab a ton of Superman stuff, trying to make up for it now. So I did go out last year and I picked up some of the figures from this line that I wanted the absolute most. Had to wait on a few yet, because unfortunately some of the more desirable figures from the line, such as Darkseid, Bizarro, they've gone up in price a little bit there, and they've become a little bit harder to come by in recent years. So I had to take a rain check on some of those, but I was able to get 4 iconic characters that I wanted to review, get a look at, ones I always wanted but never had a chance to get my hands on. And as I've said many times, that's really a lot of what we're all about here on From the Vault, is going back to the past and making up for lost time, so to speak. Not just revisiting my childhood in a sense by looking at things I had, but getting to reacquaint myself with some things I wanted but didn't get to have. So today we're going to be looking at Superman himself. We're going to be looking at Supergirl, one of the very first figures ever of Supergirl in any form or fashion. Supergirl, for such an iconic character, did not get a lot of action figure love until more recent years. Now we've got a few different ones and different styles to choose from. But if this wasn't the first Supergirl figure, it was definitely one of the first. So that's a huge deal right there. So we're going to be taking a look at her. We're going to be looking at the evil alien Brainiac. I don't know why they couldn't just call him Brainiac, but He is an evil alien, so it makes sense. And this, again, based on his animated series incarnation. Yet another character. Did not have a lot of various action figures up to this point. There was the iconic Superpowers figure from Kenner back in the mid-'80s with his more cyborg-looking silver early 80s iteration, which was very, very cool. Never had one. Really hard to find now, obviously. But this was, again, one of the first Brainiac figures ever done. Now we've had a few since then. This is definitely a cool one. Can't wait to open them up, take a better look. And last but not least, we're going to be looking at Lex Luthor. You can't have a Superman line without Lex. And again, this was only the third that I'm aware of. And again, just for the record, because some people I talk to, they sort of dispute with me because they'll bring up the Mego stuff and whatever. When I talk action figures, I specifically talk action figures. Love and respect for the Mego line of stuff, but to me they're more like dolls than what I would think of as action figures. So action figures are dolls. You know, all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. I get it, but to me, when I talk action figures, I'm usually talking about stuff like this, not the Migos. So, again, there was Battle Armor Lex Luthor in the Superpowers line from Kenner. There was a more modern Lex in the 1989 Toy Biz line. And then there was this one, right around the same time as the comic book one in the Kenner Man of Steel line. So, still pretty early on for old Lex here. For such an iconic character, you'd be amazed how long it took for a lot of figures of him to start rolling out. So, looks like a pretty good one here. And we're going to go through these one by one and take a look at them. Because, as I mentioned, I couldn't wait to get my hands on these. As a kid, I passed them over. Foolishly, I guess you'd say. But hey, we're here to make up for lost time. So the line ran for 5 waves, and most of the figures we're going to be looking at today are from Wave 1 or Series 1. Supergirl came a little bit later. She was from Series 3, I believe. And we're going to be taking a look at each of them individually, see what's good, what's bad, what's indifferent. I've never had my hands on any of these figures, so this is going to be pretty exciting for me. We're going to be back in just a moment. We're going to start off with one of the villains. Stick around. Alright, first up we're going to be taking a look at Brainiac, or Evil Alien Brainiac, in what I'm pretty sure was his second ever non-Mego action figure. Now, this is a pretty cool version of Brainiac. I like the look of it, generally speaking. The cartoon show took an interesting twist with Brainiac, actually making him part of the reason why Krypton was destroyed. That was new and unique to the cartoon show at the time. Wasn't really how it played out in the comics, but again, you know, usually adaptations, they'll put their own spin on things. I didn't have a huge problem with it. I really liked the cartoon show for a lot of reasons. It was based very heavily on the John Byrne era, the Byrne-Jurgens era of Superman in the comics, which has always been and always will be my very favorite, so I really appreciated all the little nods that the cartoon gave to those comics while also putting their own unique spin on things. So we've got a really nice looking clean Brainiac here with some pretty interesting accessories. It's the blasting space sled. It looks like something you could ride on, I guess, as well as shoot with. On the back here, got some nice illustration of Brainiac using the accessory that he comes with, interestingly. And in case you weren't aware, here you got the line of Wave 1 figures, or Series 1 figures, some of the variants of Superman that came with the line. As I've mentioned, the downfall of any kids-based superhero line is that usually the main character has dozens of what I call goofy variants or wacky variants that I just couldn't plain care less about. I don't buy them. So, but it's cool, you know, that they exist for kids and everything like that. I personally always want more unique characters, but, you know, this line did give us a few great unique characters in its own right, Brainiac being one of them. Interestingly, on this card back here, they actually show 2 toys that were for the companion line, the comic book-based Man of Steel collection, also from Kenner. The Kryptonian War Mech Battlesuit had nothing to do with this animated line, so that's interesting. Those the toys were not even entirely to scale; they were pretty close though. But yeah, that battle suit was definitely a toy from the Man of Steel line, not the animated series one. Interestingly enough, though, both versions had a iteration of the conversion coupe. It was simply recolored. I forget if the red one was for the Man of Steel line or this cartoon-based line, but they each did come with their own unique Clark Kent action figure, which was really cool. And, you know, you gotta love how figure companies back then were making the most out of their parts, reusing them. In this case, they were able to use the same toy twice for a companion toy line that was existing at the exact same time. Gotta love it. To this day, you see that with Mattel and stuff like that. People give them a hard time. I say whatever helps them get more stuff out there for us to buy. Reuse is reuse. It happens, and when they're creative with it, you know, bless them. I love it. So, what we're going to do, obviously, is we're going to take this guy out of the plastic prison after he's been in there for so long, almost 30 years he's been sitting here, so I bet he can't wait to get out, and we're going to have to keep a close eye on him so he doesn't try to take over the world. But hey, in case he does, we've got no shortage of Superman figures here to keep him in check. So we'll be back in just a second and see how he holds up out of the box. Alright, we're back, and here we have Brainiac out of the box along with the components of his blasting space sled. Interesting little accessory there. Real quick before I talk too much about the figure, I just want to take another moment to go over the card back artwork, which I didn't really talk about. I usually do, but I was so excited to get these figures open. I do really like it. It's very striking, very dynamic. I love the big, huge, bold Superman logo with Superman himself, center frame. And in case you were left in any doubt whatsoever, it tells you right there from the animated series, that's what it's all about. I even think that it looks cool out of the plastic because you get a better view of the neat little metropolis skyline they use there in the background. Very cool. I'm a big sucker for things like this. You know, I love action figure card artwork going all the way back to Masters of the Universe, which to this day people still talk about. The artwork being one of the biggest selling points for that line, and it really can make a line stand out, not just on a store shelf, but in a display or what have you. So I usually keep the cardboard, even though I throw out the plastic for a lot of stuff. It's too much. You know, you wouldn't believe how much space you save when you start opening these things. So, Brainiac himself. You get standard for the time, you get 6 points of articulation, you get 360 rotation on the head. And I gotta say, he is very snug, very playable. You know, he's been in the package almost 30 years, so he's a little stiff. But, plays well, moves well. You got the arms, just go up and down. No elbow or knee articulation, sadly. But a lot of figures at this point in time, 95, 96, they did not have them. Waist swivel there, 360, all the way around. And you got the legs go all the way forward and back, which is even better than a lot of the more modern 6 and 7 inch scales have. So hey, for the standards of the time, really awesome. This is basically what you'd expect, as I mentioned when I reviewed other figures from 95, 96, like the Legends of Batman stuff I talked about. You know, 5 or 6 POA was all you got back then, but you really didn't care because these were kids' toys and they were just for having fun with and playing around with. So, no complaints really as far as that articulation goes. I like the look of the character very much. It's like a really good blend of some of the elements of his classic Silver Age version with a little bit of the John Byrne era, with yet a little bit of the stuff that Dan Jurgens and other artists were doing with them in the mid-90s. So Brainiac is a character where the visual has always been hard to nail down. It feels like every single time we've ever seen him in comic books, at least since the 80s, he looks different. And he's almost never the same twice, so it's hard to get a really iconic, straightforward look. If somebody asks you, like, what does Brainiac look like, it's really hard to give them a straight answer. But here, I really got to say, I like the look of this version of Brainiac quite a lot. He's got his iconic Christmas light bulbs on his forehead. That's pretty standard with every version of Brainiac. He's more of a Mum-Ra blue-green than he's usually depicted as being, because in most versions he's just green. But hey, it's a way to go. I like the silver texture and color on the armored parts. I like the fact his hand is open for holding the accessory. We'll talk a little bit about that. I like the deco on the belts. The paint apps are really good. They're a little bit sloppy. Like, there's tiny little offshoots here and there if you look really close, but it's so hard to notice. And again, these are kids' toys, so it was not only common, but, you know, understandably expected. I like the shade of purple they went with for his regular, bodysuit. I think that's cool. The paint is applied well in the spots where it's painted. I like the blank eyes, very robotic. I would have probably made them red, but, you know, that's a little maybe predictable or boring. This definitely, even though it's based on the animated series, this would have absolutely been my default Brainiac when I was playing with my toys as a kid. I would have had him in with my other DC action figures, absolutely. And one of the greatest things about all the stuff Kenner put out in the 90s is that the scale was almost perfectly uniform. From the Batman animated series, to the Legends of Batman, to the Man of Steel line, to this animated series line, to Total Justice, to the JLA line when Hasbro bought Kenner out, almost all of the figures from the DC output could stand with each other uniformly. And as a collector, that's great. When you were a kid, you know, it wasn't the end of the world, but you still kind of got annoyed that if you wanted to play with your toys, Lion-O was like twice He-Man's size, and He-Man was twice as big as Superman, so stuff like that always annoyed me as a kid. But Kenner in the 90s, they were really on the ball when it came to that kind of stuff, and they just figured, hey, why don't we just make all our stuff fit together? And that just makes so much sense, right? So even though this is a cartoon-based Brainiac, I would have had him in play with all my DC stuff because you didn't really have any other Brainiacs to pick from anyway. But this is a hell of a good one. I am a big fan, and even though it's very simple, I think it's great for what it is. So the figure itself, no complaints whatsoever. Hi, Zoe. What do you think, Zoe? You like Brainiac? No. That's okay. He probably tried to enslave you anyway. I know you're not having that. Zoe's more of a Batman dog. Zoe's always watching me play Batman. Yep, see, she's going to go watch Batman right now. So, we have the figure itself. Bye, Zoe! She'll probably be back later. She's a very restless dog. She's great. But yeah, like I said, this Brainiac, I gotta say, for the standards of 1995, what can you say? It's a 10. I mean, figures didn't get better than this at that time. They just didn't. And I'm never ever gonna knock points off or cite sins of an action figure line from 25, 30 years ago for not being up to the standards of stuff that came out in the 2000s to today. It just, to me, is not fair. You have to take things as they were. So to me, this is a fantastic Brainiac figure. I give it a 10. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the accessories, because kids action figure line, you had to have the accessories. I will be perfectly honest. My standard as a kid was I took the figures out of the package, and stuff like this, because it was so big and clunky and ugly, I really didn't mess with it too much. Either I would throw them in a box and forget about them, or sometimes I'd lose them. But, I mean, they're cool, right? It's cool for, you know, what they're meant to be, which is for kids to play with. So you got this little rocket launcher gimmick here, which is pretty cool and pretty straightforward. You just load the missile into the front there. I mean, if you had a superhero action figure in the 90s, you had something like this. Most figures came with something like this. You press a little button, boom, and just shoots off like that. What's cool about this one, thanks, Coach. What's cool about this one is that it pulls double duty. So you've got the sled, which is actually pretty cool. It's got a rocker seat for, I guess, posability and functionality. Kind of cool right there. So Brainiac himself, he just kind of sits on the chair like he's getting on the Batman ride at Six Flags. Locks in nicely at the waist there, so now he's good to go. And then what you would do here is you take this little peg, You just pop it in right there. You know, now he's ready for any kind of action. As far as being ready to take on Superman or any of the Justice League. So that's kind of cool, but I'll be honest, I probably would have never used the weapon in this capacity. I mean, it takes up a lot of space. It was, you know, these kind of things were not my thing. I just liked the base figures and minimal weapons and accessories. But it's cool. I dig it. It's not just a big solid piece of plastic, and that's neat. It kind of doesn't like to stay balanced because of the weight of the figure, and he's got a weird recliner thing going on. But hey, if you don't like that, and you just like the cannon, that's cool too, because you could just very simply remove the sled from the equation. And that goes right in his hand. Now again, like a lot of the figures from back then, if you wanted to do that, you'd either need to get a figure stand base or pose them a little awkwardly, because that was another reason I didn't really mess with accessories too much for action figures back then, is they tended to make the figures very front heavy and make them want to fall over. So for posing on a shelf, not ideal. But if you're playing with them, doesn't matter, because you'd always have one hand on them for stability anyway. You just like, pow, and there it would be. So, welcome back, Zoe. Yeah, see, she doesn't like the Brainiacs at large, and he's trying to... Oh, maybe she likes the missile. Please don't eat it, Zoe. Please don't eat it, Zoe. You'd be amazed what she gets into. It's not a napkin, so she's probably not going to eat it. But yeah, so... you know, great for kids play. Really cool accessory, even though I don't really recall Brainiac using missile launchers or ray guns all that often. However, maybe some of his robot sentries would have. But, you know, hey, it's not offsides. I dig it. But realistically, for shelf posing, you'd want to put these in a bag or a box somewhere, because he's not going to stand. That's the only flaw, I would say, with the figure. And it's not even with the figure, it's just with the accessory. And that being, the accessory is going to make him front heavy. But he stands pretty decent on his own, I say as he falls over. But no, there are holes in the feet in case you do have a base. It does not come with one. The figures from this line did not have bases. He actually fell because Zoe is laying under the table and she keeps headbutting it. Big goof. So if you have a spare base handy, that'll help with any of these figures, but they do stand pretty well on their own as long as it's on a stable, non-shaky surface. So, again, the figure itself, base figure, front to back, A to Z, zero complaints. Love the Brainiac figure. Less in love with the Brainiac accessories, but you know what? If you don't like them, you don't need them. Alright, from one of the villains to one of the heroes in one of her very first action figure depictions, we have the one and only Supergirl. Now, again, this is not Superman's cousin, Supergirl. In the 90s, due to various editorial factors in both the comic book and spin-off media, they were not able to use other Kryptonians for the most part besides Superman himself, so therefore the comics and the cartoons and various iterations of Supergirl all had much different origins. And the cartoon had its own that was unique from any other, but still Supergirl, and still a pretty cool depiction of Supergirl. This was the first appearance of her modernized outfit with the t-shirt and so on, which some people have mixed feelings about, but we have seen a few different versions of this Supergirl since then, but this was the first, and it would come to be well known in the Peter David series of comic books later on. The look actually originated in the cartoon show, and then they brought it over to the comics a few years later. Usually things go in the reverse, but I guess a lot of people really liked this look. I'm okay with it. So, Supergirl here, this was a Series 3 figure, and we'll flip it over. On the back, you'll get a look at some of the other figures and variants in the Series 3. Supergirl comes with her aerial assault armor. Why she would need armor, who knows? Maybe, I don't know, maybe they're on a mission where there's a red sun or something like that. Even though this Supergirl wasn't from Krypton, but rather the planet Argo, which was a planet that was colonized by Kryptonians in the cartoon show, which could not have happened in the comic books because when Byrne revamped it, he wrote that Kryptonians were genetically bound to their home planet, so they were not able to leave Krypton without dying. Kal-El was immune to this because he was the first natural birth on Krypton in many, many, many years. So, but in the cartoon show, the Kryptonians colonized the sister planet called Argo. Of course, a nod to Argo City in the comics, where the Kryptonian Supergirl originally hailed from. I know my stuff, man. So she was from Argo, but I assume that since she was probably at least part Kryptonian anyway, maybe she was vulnerable to a red sun, and maybe that's why for this particular mission that she's going to be on, she needs armor and missiles. Who knows? Either way, kind of cool accessories, great looking Supergirl figure. Again, you got a great looking package. This figure also came out as part of a box set sometime later with Superman, Metallo, and Bizarro, sorry. And those figures, Bizarro and Metallo, a little tougher to get, so I don't have them yet, but hopefully very, very soon. So, let's take her out of the box and see how she holds up. Is she as cool as Brainiac? I sure hope so. Let's find out. Alright, so here we have Supergirl as she appears fresh out of the package. I haven't taken anything off or put anything on it. This is what she looks like when you pop her open. Now, there's some good and some bad. The bad would be, right off the bat, this figure has almost no articulation because of what they chose to do with the lower body and the head. The hair is all one solid hard brick of plastic, so even though it's relatively well sculpted for the standards of a toy based on a cartoon show, you do get some good detail on the bangs and a little bit of the back of the hair too, but it is a lump of solid hard plastic, which means the articulation in the head is almost non-existent. You get a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. That's it. Arms, you get really good articulation, which is great. And the waist, like the others, you get the 360. However, you have nothing below the waist. She may as well be Barbara Gordon because she is dead below the waist. And don't want to do it upskirt here, but I have to just so you see what I mean. The entire lower body, skirt, legs, and everything is one solid piece. Zero articulation below the belt, and that's very disappointing to me because I feel like there's ways they probably could have worked around this. For example, all her armor parts that she's wearing are soft rubber. The cape is a rubber. I feel like they could have given her an actual lower body with articulation and made the skirt out of the same material as the cape. I don't know why they didn't. Maybe it was cost saving. I don't know. So right off the bat, huge flaw in the figure. Only 3.5 points of articulation because the head doesn't move that much. So you got the two arms and the waist, and that's all you get. Kind of a bummer. Now, again, the figure itself, though, as far as the look of it, pretty cool. As far as accessories go, she comes with quite a bit because in addition to the chest piece, the two wrist-mounted gauntlets, the missiles that go into said gauntlets, but her armor pieces on her arms and legs are also simply accessories that come off. So you get a good number of accessories with her, and that's pretty cool. Whether or not you care for them, that's up to personal interpretation. I would have taken all this stuff off immediately and thrown it in a box when I was a kid. But, I mean, it's there if you want it, and that's pretty cool. It snaps on and off very easily, so now she's ready for outer space missions. The gauntlet gimmick is pretty interesting here. There's actually no button to make it fire like most of these would have, which is kind of interesting. Like most of these toys back then, you kind of just stuck it in the slot there. But again, there's no actual locking mechanism, so it's kind of loosey-goosey, which is a little bit unfortunate there. The gauntlets go right into these little holes on the wristbands there. I guess those are the gauntlets, and I guess I'd call these the wrist launchers. I don't know. I'm winging it, bro. And so just kind of get that in there, make sure it's not going to pop out, but that's easier said than done, as you will see. And they kind of just pop in like that. And now she's ready for action. Welcome back, Zoe. Which is cool. It's a bit ostentatious. Like, you could not stand her without a base. She does have foot pegs if you do have a base. Without a base, she would not want to stand with these things on her arms. and you couldn't adjust the legs to force it to stand, so you would really need a base. But again, if you were just a kid playing with it, you'd always be holding it like this anyway. So what you got to kind of do to make these things fire is just sort of tap it with your thumb, which is cool in a way, but also kind of crummy because it's, as you can see, very inconsistent with how it wants to work. The first one just flew right off, and that one I had to kind of force. So, I don't know. Thank you, Coach. Again, they didn't put in a button like almost every other action figure with a gimmick like this would have had. But, I mean, it's cool. I guess it's one less part that could potentially break, and it does work. You just tap it and they go, but sometimes, as you saw, you got to kind of finagle it a little bit. But, as I said, if I was a kid, I wouldn't have even cared because I would have taken this stuff off immediately. I would have played with it once out of the box. I would have said, hey, that's cool. And then I would have just gotten rid of it. I would not thrown it out, but I would have just put it in a bag or something. But again, the good news is, if you're not a huge fan of the armor pieces and you say, well, the arms come right off. A little Supergirl striptease here. I'd buy that for $1. And the leg pieces also pop right off. They're not super soft. They're not as soft as the cape, but they're a soft enough plastic where they just go on and off very easily. You've seen a million figures like this over the years. Pretty standard and pretty cool. So you get a choice of how you want to display, and now you've got just your basic Supergirl figure with the tiny little cape, the belly shirt, so hot, the mini skirt, so hot, and the short boots, the lace-ups, the Doc Martens, whatever you want to call them there. This was a very 90s version of Supergirl, and I got to admit, when I saw the pictures of the figure online, I was a little hesitant to buy it at first because I wasn't sure if the armor parts all came off, but I'm really glad they do. This is definitely how I'm going to display this figure in all her majesty. And, I feel like I don't need to clutter the armor. I'm glad that they made all that stuff removable so that if you want it, it's fine. But if you don't want it, then you just have your very basic Supergirl. And it's a great version of her. It really is. Proportion-wise, like a lot of female action figures back then, a little bit frail compared to the men. But as I said, it's fine. She is Supergirl, and she's, she doesn't have to be She-Hulk to get the point across that she's a powerful superhero in her own right. So I really dig this look. I really liked it when it crossed over into the comics a few years later. It's dynamic. It really sets her out as her own character and not just Superman with a skirt, because that's always been a problem with the presentation of the Supergirl character, is how to make her unique and relevant. And sometimes the comics do a good job, sometimes they fumble it, but this was, between cartoon and comic alike, this was one of my favorite versions of Supergirl, and I have a few different versions of her in this outfit, from DC Direct to Mattel and all points in between, but this is the first that they did of her in this look, and I'm glad to finally have it. I'm definitely going to have to go, 8 or 9 out of 10 because of the no articulation below the waist, because it does affect the figure as far as posability. She'll stand normally on her own, but, a base would definitely come in handy. You can't adjust the legs to get a better stability, so that kind of blows. And again, if you use her armor wrist launchers, it's going to make her front heavy, and you can't even balance the legs to fix it. So I can't give it a 10 out of 10 ultimately, but I think, she's a 9 out of 10 if you're just posing her, like that. 9 out of 10, hey, as far as just looking good on a shelf, I'd say 10 out of 10. But, would be good to have a little bit of articulation there. So overall, a great figure, just not perfect. But, again, for what this would have been, I believe, 1997 or 98 when this figure came out. So it's about what you'd expect, but still, other figures of the time had a little bit better job with the articulation. I feel like they kind of got maybe a little lazy there, and I just would have liked something better. But who knows? We got 2 more to go, and they'll probably be a little bit better, but this isn't bad. Like I said, I'll go 9 out of 10 for just posing. 8 out of 10 if you actually want to move her around a little bit. Still a great Supergirl. You should definitely pick it up if you're a Supergirl fan. Coming up next, we're going to jump back over to the villain side of the fence. Hang out. Alright, back over to the villain side of the fence, we have Lex Luthor in his kryptonite armor battle suit. And as I mentioned, this was, depending on the exact timeline, this was either the 3rd or 4th Lex Luthor action figure that I'm aware of, because you had the Superpowers one in the mid-80s, you had the Toy Biz one in 89 or so, and then right around the same time you had this one and a Lex Luthor in the Kenner Man of Steel line. So this would have been either 3rd or 4th, depending on the exact date of release. But either way, as I mentioned, always great to have a Lex Luthor figure, because you can't have Superman without his arch enemy. On the back here, you see some nice cartoon-based artwork of him using the battle armor. And I do gotta say, it's an interesting design. It's inspired. It's definitely reminiscent of his classic battle armor from the comics and the cartoons, but a little bit uglier in my opinion, but we'll see how it looks out of the box. But yeah, I definitely knew I had to get this one straight away, because you can't have Superman without Lex, and especially for this scale and this type of action figures, your pickings were slim, so definitely needed to have this guy in the line. Let's take a look and see how he holds up outside the box. Alright, so here we have Lex Luthor with his kryptonite armor and kryptonite launcher accessory. Again, it is pretty clearly inspired very loosely by his classic Superpowers battle armor. Totally different execution and style. Everything about it is different, but you can still see, based on the basic shape of it, where the inspiration came from. And apparently, more than half of this armor costume is made of kryptonite, which... Do you want cancer, Lex Luthor? Because that's how you get cancer. At least in the comic books, where he did actually get cancer simply from wearing a kryptonite ring, and it spread into his bones. He lost his hand, but then spread to the rest of him, and he ended up having to fake his own death and come back in a clone body where he was pretending to be his own son until that fell apart, and he ended up selling his soul to Neron, the devil himself. And God, comics are weird sometimes. But the fact of the matter is, the cartoons obviously are different, because if kryptonite in the cartoons gave a person cancer, this guy would be riddled with tumors walking out around dressed like that. So I'm willing to assume that in the cartoon show, kryptonite is only harmful to Superman and nobody else, which never made any sense to me, because if kryptonite is in fact a radioactive isotope, then that would imply an element of danger across the board, not just the one guy. I don't know. I'm no physicistician or science-tician or anything like that. I don't know. To me, I just think it's dangerous to be walking around wearing a costume made of radioactive rock, but what do I know? The outfit is, clunky, a little fugly, but I mean, it works for the purposes of a kid's toy line where this kind of thing was the standard. The top piece moves with the arms. You do get good articulation, and the armor does not really hinder that so much at all, so that's really cool. He will stand, which is cool, and the wide feet on the armor definitely help with that quite a bit. He's pretty sturdy. I will say the pose is a little bit weird, because he's got like a Spider-Man web shooter thing going on in his right hand, so that's weird, but it is what it is. It's not terrible. It's just weird, like I've talked about a million times. 1990s action figures, you had some element of pre-posing going on. Sometimes it was better than others. Now you have his kryptonite launcher weapon accessory here. A lot of good detail on the sculpt of that. They definitely put some work in on this. Looks cool, very high-tech looking. They could have probably borrowed it from another toy line. I don't know, maybe they did. This is the, I don't know what this is supposed to be specifically. It's a missile that shoots out of the launcher. What kind of missile, I don't know. Again, 90s toys, man. They would just take anything and they would put it in the box, and that's, you may do with it. I don't know. Like I said, it's not bad, but I never gave a crap about any of this kind of stuff, and I usually just put it in the corner. But, again, you got the projectile that goes into the launcher, you got to make sure it's the right way, and there's no button to press. What you would do here is you kind of tap it from underneath, and it goes flying off like that. Just like the Supergirl missiles. Jesus! No one, Ryan? Settle down! But yeah, I mean, it's, again, most of these kind of things, most of these kind of toys would have had a button you hit, but this one did not. Now, there's 3 places you could attach the launcher to Lex. You can clip it to his back, where I would pretend, for my own fun, that it was like some kind of rocket pack he'd be flying around with, you know? That's how I probably would have rolled as a kid. But both arms also have tiny little holes in the armor gauntlets, just like Supergirl's. So when you're ready to have him attack Superman here, what you would do, you just plug the 2 holes. And I like that these things generally, this line of figures, they have 2 holes for stability to make it go in more. But again, the problem here being that the way he's posed, he will not be able to hold it straight, really. He's kind of shooting up and away, so he'd kind of be attacking Superman from underneath. The box art has him using it on the right arm. On the left arm, works a little bit better because he can sidearm it. He doesn't have that weird Spider-Man thing going on. But again, even with the wide feet base, this figure will not stand with the accessory clip to it on either of the arms. It's just going to pull him forward, and this was a very common thing with a lot of superhero action figures back in the 90s, which is a big reason, as I said, why I usually just chuck these guys in a bin, these accessories, because they messed up the whole thing. You cannot put him on a shelf holding this thing. You can, I believe, he'll still stand on his own when it's just clipped to his back. I don't think it's necessarily so awkward. Like, he'll stand with it like that, but that's kind of ugly, right? It looks weird. He looks like he's got a waffle growing out the back of his neck or something. It's just weird. But, you know, that's the only way you can get the figure and the accessory to stand up together. Otherwise, you know, you'd have to very awkwardly just kind of put it like that, which sucks too. But, you know, I mean, it's a working accessory. I would have made this missile totally different myself. I think the missile launcher is cool. I think this missile, while it is kind of Jack Kirby-esque, it also is kind of nonsense, right? It just looks weird. I don't know. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It looks like a big fly swatter or a spatula or something. I don't know. But again, the whole point of it was to be able to aim it and go like that, and it does that. So hey, nothing wrong with it specifically, just not really my thing. But hey, if you like that kind of thing, good for you. Now, one of the best things, just like the Supergirl figure, if you hate the armor, guess what? You don't need it. It comes right off very easily. Every piece of it comes off within seconds. This one actually reminds me very, very much of the Superman Returns Lex Luthor that we looked at in another video, where he had a very similar gimmick, you might remember. He had the kryptonite armor that just snapped on very similarly. This one hugs a bit more snug because these really grip the ankles and feet, but they still are made of a plastic that's just pliable enough. You can even kind of very lightly twist it without breaking it. It's just pliable enough to go on and off without much fuss. So that is very cool. A little bit less cool is the fact that Lex without his armor is in a very basic and almost boring undersuit. Looks like a scuba suit. Again, not terrible, but one of the biggest problems if you were a fan of Lex or you wanted a figure of Lex is that 99% of the time it's battle armor or nothing. And if it's not his armor, he's wearing some kind of undersuit like that. Whereas in the comics and the cartoon, Lex was generally depicted with regular business suit, and you didn't get too many of those at all, unfortunately. But you got to make do with what you got. So at least if you hate the armor, you still have a reasonable Lex Luthor figure without the armor. And I gotta say, the bodysuit isn't terrible. It's like a gray black with like a teal highlight in the piping. The detail on the piping is cool. The good sculpt there, you know, nothing fancy, but I mean, it's nice that they even bothered. The tubing on the back of his legs even has some sculpt going on there. Very neat. Again, this even in his stripped down form, you could see the inspiration from the earlier Battle Armor Lex Luthor figures. I have no idea why he's doing the Spider-Man thing. I just don't know. But without the armor, you can get a better idea of the articulation. Again, you get a full 360-degree head swivel. Same with the waist. You can just go full Beetlejuice on you. The arms go all the way around, but of course no side to side. Just like the rest of this line, no elbow or knee articulation. Unfortunately, elbows and knees were something Kenner did in earlier lines, but then by the mid-90s they were phasing it out, regrettably. Thankfully, they would bring it back in a big way a few years later, and Mattel would increase on that, thankfully. But again, very standard for what you got with action figures at the time. It's hard to rate, really, because it is a great Lex. It's just, I'd feel better about it if we also had a business suit Lex Luthor as a companion to this, but we'd have to wait a while for that, unfortunately. God, you bastard. And again, like they all do, they do have foot peg holes if you do have some spare bases laying around, but if you get him in the right pose on the right surface, you know, he won't be too awkward. It's really just the arms, pose of the arms lead him forward. But he actually stands much better in the armor, as I showed you, because the feet are a lot wider with the armor on, so he's got a lot more stability. So pick your way of display and go nuts, because you really can't go wrong either way. I don't love either look. I'm gonna go 9 out of 10 on this one and say that the posability is great for the time, the articulation. I like the gimmick with the snap-on armor. The missile launcher is neat, even though I don't really get the missile itself. But it's just such a bizarre look in general. The armor is a little bit busy. I do like the way it snaps on and off, but it's just I would have done another pass at this figure. I would have, you know, done something different on multiple fronts. But I mean, it's great, and you can't really go wrong because you need a Lex. So I'll go 9 out of 10, maybe 8 if I'm in a bad mood. But you know, he does have the full articulation, and it looks just like Lex. So you'd be dumb to pass it up if you collect this line. I mean, you know, you gotta have Lex Luthor, even though it's not the ideal picture-perfect version I would have liked. It's still one you need in your collection, so definitely check it out. We have one more to go, and we're going to be jumping back to the hero side with the greatest hero of all time. Stick around. Alright, moment of truth. We saved the best for last. We have Superman. Not just Superman, but CaptureNet Superman. Now, as I've mentioned a million times, I am never a huge fan of the goofy variants. When it comes to a kid's superhero line, I don't like them. I don't buy them most of the time. There's a chance I may pick up a few down the road for the purposes of this channel, and I can find them cheap, but they're not what I'm into. I'm always trying to find the purest, cleanest, most iconic version of every character, and for this line, this was the Superman you wanted to get. This CaptureNet Superman was the basic, no fuss, no muss, no crazy gimmicks, no wacky alternate costumes. He does have a goofy weapon that you could just pretend he doesn't have. And outside of that, this is Superman in its purest and most iconic form based on the cartoon show. I'm going to flip it around, and again, you'll get the cartoon artwork of Superman using his goofy CaptureNet snare shooter. Why he would use this or why he would need this, I have no idea, but again, it's a kid's toy and this is what you got before and up, blah blah blah. You get the cross-sell of the rest of Series 1, Wave 1. Again, there were about 5 series of figures for this line. This Superman figure here got a lot of reuse. This figure would show up in 2-packs and box sets for years, simply because, again, this was the only Superman in the line that was clean and didn't have an abundance of wacky gimmicks or a goofy costume. There were only 20 different figures in this series, and most of them were Superman variants. But this Superman would show up in 2-packs with Batman. He showed up in a box set with Battle of Metropolis with Lex, Brainiac, same figures as I showed you before, and a Lois Lane that you could only get in that box set. Very, very, very unfortunate that they kept her locked up with that. That's why I don't still have one. And they also did a Superman, Supergirl, Metallo, and Brainiac, or a Bizarro, I'm sorry, box set. So this figure made the rounds for many years until this line was discontinued. And so I actually even have another one of them somewhere, but I wanted to get this one single card for the purposes of opening it and getting the real feel for what it would have been like to be a kid back in 95, 96, popping this guy out. So we're going to do just that. We're going to come back and we're going to see just how the Man of Steel himself holds up to the rest of the line. Stick around. Alright, as I mentioned, we're saving the man himself for last. Here we have Superman with his ridiculous, goofy, pretty stupid capture net and S-shield snare accessory. We're going to talk a little bit about that momentarily, but for now we're just going to stick it over there. Not a fan of the accessories, just not, but again, as I keep saying, for the purposes of a kid's toy line, they're fine for the most part, with an asterisk toward this one that I'll get to in a second. I want to talk about the figure more than anything, and how is the figure? Well, it's great. It's Superman. It's Superman based on the cartoon version, animated series, and it's clean, it's great, it's perfect. It's got a softer blue that a lot of people prefer, even though later versions of this figure, or later versions of this character, this animated Superman, would use a much darker blue, but this one is more in line with what I'm always hearing people say they kind of prefer. They like a little bit of a softer, lighter blue, and that's fine. The costume looks great, with the exception of, as many figures do, they cheaped out on the belt loops. I'm absolutely going to take a lick of red paint and paint those belt loops red, as they deserve to be. Unfortunately, many Superman figures cheap out on that, or used to, but I hate it when they do. Even on the back, they don't. The cape, just like many capes of Superman figures in the 90s, it just goes right in the back with two little peg holes and rests very nicely on his shoulders, right at the seam line of where it would tuck into his bodysuit, so it looks pretty clean like that. It doesn't float like some of the other capes like this do. It goes on really snug. It integrates really well into the figure. Now, one minor flaw here is that thanks to the cape and the fact that it's been in the package for many years, you do got some paint rub right there at the collarbone, because as many figures were, it was molded in blue plastic with the flesh tone painted on later. So time and friction have revealed that, but if I want to, I can just take a little bit of peach, fix that up, no problem. The rest of the paint applications are really good. No bleed or overspray or cracking that I could see, outside of maybe very minor on the boots at the ridges, but it's hard to paint those areas, I should know. So once again, for the standards of a 1995 action figure, the paint and deco and coloring and decal work and everything is really good. It's just not perfect. It does need a little bit of touching up, so that's what I'm gonna do. It's unfortunate, I am gonna factor that in, gonna give my final opinion, but the likeness is perfect. That looks exactly like Superman from the cartoon, right down to the little black dots for eyeballs and the shape of the hair and the S-curve articulation, just like all the other figures except Supergirl. You've got the full 360-degree head. Some of these guys, the joints are so snug that right out of the package, they do move great, but some of them you got to kind of play with a little bit to get them to go. The arms are really good. You got full 360 on both arms. You have the waist, of course, and the legs. Really good forward to back articulation there. So again, standard posability compared to what you'd get in 1995, and no complaints there. For the figure itself, I'm going to go 9 out of 10 just because they cheaped out on the belt loops. It's a tiny little nick of red paint. Why would you leave that out ever? And why do they leave it out always? Like on so many figures from this era, they just don't paint the belt loops. And then I got to do their job for them. And it gives me a migraine. But you know what? It's fine. It's going to take 2 seconds to fix. But because I am doing work they should have done at the factory, I am going to take a point off. even though by the standards of the day, it was fine. Rest of the figure, though, perfect, no complaints. If I had no other Superman figures at the time, this would have been my default very easily. Again, even though it's an animated Superman, it fits in great with all the other DC figures that Kenner was putting out those years between the mid-90s. It was very stock, very standard, and it was a great likeness of a very specific version of Superman. So, you know, it's almost perfect. Almost. Just one little thing. And that's the figure. Now, the accessory, well, I don't like it on multiple levels. Number one, it's kind of an interesting idea, I guess. It basically is a missile launcher that shoots a net at bad guys when it functions correctly. But first of all, who the hell ever thought this was a good idea? Like, who thought this would be a weapon that Superman, of all characters, would ever need or make use of? It's like somebody saw Superman 2 and was like, why don't we do it like that, but even stupider? Which I didn't think was possible, but then I saw this friggin' thing. So, yeah, it's kind of like that, where he does the thing, and pew, and it's like, and it's like, why? And you're like, pfft. So, that's what this is, with his capture net. Like, would it really be any quicker to fire a net launcher at a bad guy than it would be for Superman to, I don't know, just like tie him up? Like, I guess maybe he's, you know, his back is out and he doesn't want to walk 3 feet. I don't know. So ideally how it would work is you would put these missiles into the launcher, and this one actually does have a button to fire the missiles, but we're going to talk about that in a moment. You can see here the missile launcher has the S shield on it in case he ever misplaces it. He needs to, you know, remind people whose goofy looking missile launcher it is. And so the missiles would plug into there, and then you would just put the net onto the male end of the missile there. You can put it on anywhere, you know. And then you would just stick it on his arm and point it at a bad guy and press the button. Now, I say ideally that's how it would work because at some point in the 30 years or so, 28 years that this thing's been in a package, mine's actually broken. The missiles don't go all the way in, and you could feel something broken when you hit the button. The part that is in there is responsible for pushing the missiles out simply does not work. So the bad news is I couldn't use this accessory if I wanted to. That's the bad news. The good news is it's ugly anyway. Screw it. It's dumb. I don't like it. I don't like really any of the accessories except the Supergirl one's okay, I guess, even though it looks like she's firing like toilet plungers at people. But you know, and Brainiac's is okay, I guess. I would have definitely bought these even as a kid just for the figures. All of these accessories I would have chucked right in the bin. Not the trash bin, but the toy bin, and I never would have looked at them again, just being honest. And that's what I'm going to do with these two. I'm going to put them in my storage bags with a lot of the other things I got. The figures, they'll probably find a home on one of my many shelves, but the accessories will not. I'm going to take the armor off of them and the weapons, and they're just going in a box. And I'm just going to have the figures themselves standing there. So this is how it would look, and again, you would never be able to display him because the accessories weigh more than the figures do. So on all of these figures, if you wanted to try to pose them with their weapons, you can't do it because they're just going to lean forward. Literally, the weapons for each of these figures, they weigh about as much as the figure themselves, so it just doesn't work. But screw it, I don't care. And again, I'm not going to take points off for the accessory being broken or ugly because, again, I wouldn't have bought these for the accessories anyway. I don't care about them. It's a nice little bonus, but to me, I'm all about the figure, and this figure to me is great. It's just a hair off from perfect. I love it. It's got, you know, anything you'd expect from a 1996 Superman figure. I love the color, I love the sculpt, I love the pose even. This is a very clean, distinct Superman pose. We've seen some figures that, for one reason or another, you know, poor Superman, sometimes he gets the shaft when it comes to posability, but this guy, oh man, he'd look great anywhere. So, might want to invest in a base, but he will usually stand on his own if you just finagle him a little bit. These figures are pretty good for stability. The tablecloth kind of throws him off a little bit here. But yeah, I mean, I love this figure. I would love to go 10 out of 10, but you know, those belt loops, man, why? Just why? But it is what it is. I really like these figures. We're going to be back in just a second because I want to do a little compare and contrast. But yeah, when it comes to the 4 figures in the line, this one is my favorite just because, hey, it's Superman. We'll be right back in a second. I want to show you something cool. Alright, so as I always like to do when I can, we're going to do a little quick compare and contrast between a couple of the animated versions of Superman. Animated Superman's had quite a few releases in action figure form, from Kenner to Mattel to DC Direct, and all points in between. There's been McFarlane's, you know, animated Superman's been done not as much as animated Batman, but still quite a lot. And I wanted to show you how we went from the first animated Superman action figure to some of the evolution. Now, this here was the first figure I reviewed on the channel, the Justice League Unlimited Superman from Mattel, which would have come out a few years after the Kenner version. And now Justice League Unlimited had slightly different art and everything compared to the original Superman cartoon, but still the same basic version of Superman. I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of how we started, you know, how it started, how it's going, or whatever the meme is. I don't meme well. But yeah, you'll see it's definitely Superman from the cartoons either way. This one is, for better and worse, more accurate to the cartoon than this one is. This one kind of puts a cartoon head onto a more generic Superman body, whereas this, from head to toe, is the Bruce Timm style of Superman figure, right down to the boxy muscles and the scrawny legs that make it very difficult for him to stand up on his own. Of course, he's doing it right now, but I've got him posed perfectly for that reason. See, you just got to make me look stupid, don't you, jerk? It's got the darker blue of the cartoons, which was a little bit more accurate. So again, they were about 5 years apart or so, I want to say, as far as release. So you could see quite a few differences as well as the similarity, despite being based on the same version of Superman. Isn't that weird? That said, though, and they did paint the belt loops on this one, which I got to give them credit for. And the S shield is drawn on more accurately to the way it would have looked in the cartoon, whereas this one uses the stock model shield S that they use on all merchandising and advertising. The way that his cape hangs, this one has a permanent cape, this one is removable, but you know, this is the way his cape looked more accurately to the cartoons. So again, a lot of little differences, a lot of similarities, but more differences really the more you look at it. I will say though, as controversial as it might be to some, and even though this was the first figure I reviewed for the channel, I do have to say, despite the fact this one is much more cartoon accurate, I do still kind of prefer this one because it's got a little bit more dynamic pose. It is a little bit less static. Like, you know, this one's pose is just very stiff and boring, and it's like he only really looks right in this one basic mugshot pose. Whereas this guy here, you know, he looks like he's ready for any kind of action all the time. He's got his double fists ready to roll. I don't know, I love them both for what they are. They're two great versions of animated Superman, but even though this one's more accurate, and I am a purist to a fault, at a glance and in my hand, I do have a little bit more preference for this one, I'm not gonna lie. But then of course, as I said, the main point is just to kind of see and reflect on the evolution of Superman as an animated action figure, because when you really stop and admire all the steps along the way, which is what I like to do, I'm always talking about bringing old school to the new school, but also to appreciate how we got from A to the Z. And it amazes me to this day when I look at these things and I hold them in my hand, how we could start with something like this, and then we got something like this, and there's one kind of evolution, and then ultimately we fast forward a bunch of years to something like that. And I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? Like, it's the same character, but over 25 years of evolution in action figure manufacturing and articulation, paint apps, deco, attention to color schemes, and just all these things that we could begin in one place and then evolve to another place that's a little bit more cartoon accurate, but maybe a little less fun, and then you end up with something that is just truly immaculate and spectacular. And we are going to talk about this guy one day. We're going to be talking about a few of the McFarlane figures, specifically some Superman and Batman stuff. But man, I love to do stuff like this. You notice when I do these videos, I like to do these comparisons, and I like to see where we started, where we are, and how we got there. It's a beautiful thing. Alright, so there they are, all four of the figures I looked at today. We've got Superman and Supergirl over here on the hero's side, and on the villain side we have, reunited at last, and it feels so good, the infamous Brainiac Luthor team, which goes all the way back to the early 80s, and let's be honest, never ends well for anyone involved, especially not these two bozos. But they are a pair. They're like sour chocolate and rancid peanut butter, I guess, but they are generally a team, and so that's part of why those were the first two villains I picked for the purposes of this review. That combined with the fact that Metallo, Bizarro, and Darkseid were just a little bit out of range for me at the point. But they are around, and you can find them, and I definitely will be getting them to review for this channel in the future. I might go with the box set versions just to have them. I don't know. We'll see what happens on that. But again, these are great figures based on a very specific chapter of Superman history, that phenomenal 90s animated series. I could nitpick the hell out of them. I could talk about missing paint apps, or the lack of articulation, or the fact that Lex is doing the Spider-Man thing, or why Supergirl has some kind of weird underhand fist thing that was totally impractical. I could talk all day about the goofy gadgets and the gimmicks that I don't care at all about, and I'm just going to stick in a drawer or a bin. But you know what? At the end of the day, the reason I bought these was for what you're looking at right here, which is these four figures. And gotta say, you know, just as figures, they look great, they play well. Of course they could be better, but for 1996, I mean, I wouldn't have cried about it. I would have loved to have gotten any of these figures for birthday or Christmas, and I'm really glad to have them now. If I had them then, they absolutely would have worked into my action figure rotation, right next to the Total Justice and the other Kenner stuff, the Legends of Batman, all that. They scale well with them, as you'll see when I start to review some of those videos. Do videos reviewing some of those figures, rather. Pulling them out, doing compare and contrast. You'll see just how well the scale works and all of that. But, I mean, again, overall, I'd say they're a solid 9 out of 10 across the board. I mean, it's just they could have been better, but they would have been if they were made a few years later. That's not the fault of the people making them. For the standards, these are great. I'm really, really glad that I finally have them. I can't wait to get more of them. I'm probably not going to get all the variants, but as I usually do, I at least am hoping to get one of every character. I got to get that box set with the Lois Lane. I got to get the Clark Kent figure. There's a lot still to come, obviously, so stick around, and we'll get to it one day. But for now, that's going to do it. This has been yet another DC retrospective here on From the Vault. I'm never going to run out of DC stuff to review. I've got Mattel's DC Universe Classics, I've got the DC Direct, I've got Kenner, Hasbro, Toy Biz, I've got it all, and you're going to get to see what I got little by little by little. I really thank you so much for sticking with me. You know what to do with the like, share, subscribe, and all of that good stuff. Check these guys out on your favorite online retailers, see if they got them, or check out your local flea market. I almost always find something from this line when I go out flea market hopping, so you probably will too, I wouldn't doubt it. If you're a Superman fan, and especially of the cartoons, check them out. So until next time, this has been a blast. I hope you guys had fun. It's been From the Vault, Rikki Roxx Retro Action Figure Review. We're going to catch you next time.